think it takes forever to make a loaf of bread? Well, from the memories of my mother, it used to. That's why I stayed away from bread baking for so many years. Then I met a woman who gave me her recipe using a few ingredients and little time. Her claim that was in an hour and a half, she could get 4 loaves of bread. I found out that the trick was in the kneading and the gluten flour. So I began my plot, not only to bake bread, but to change my family's lifestyle from a white bread family to a whole wheat family. So the first thing I did was I baked 1 loaf of white bread just to get them hooked. Then after that, every time I would make bread, I would substitute whole wheat flour for part of the white flour until I got to where I was doing half white flour to half wheat flour. After a few months, I switched totally over to all whole wheat flour, and I can say that the change has been successful. A lot of people say they can't bake a good loaf of bread because it's just too hard, but I say you just don't understand the baking process. It's simple. You add enough ingredients together so that the yeast has something to feed on. Now, after so many years of baking bread and having some failures, I realized that atmospheric pressure can affect how your bread dough rises. Some days when there's a storm or when the humidity is high, that pressure presses down on your bread dough, making it difficult for it to rise. You see, when you buy a loaf of store-bought bread, it's made in a controlled climate kitchen. But your kitchen is a hard climate to control. So, understanding this, I found out that if you add a few tablespoons of gluten flour to the ingredients, it actually helps it rise fluffier and faster, even on those high pressure days. The next thing to understand is your yeast. Yeast feeds on sugar, and when you add heat with wheat flour or even white flour, it creates gluten, and that makes your bread dough rise. So adding that gluten flour also gives something else extra for your yeast to feed on, making it again rise higher and fluffier. So don't be afraid of your bread dough, just mix your ingredients together and let science do its thing. Now I have to say that my favorite machine for doing any baking or mixing is the Bosch mixer. Now I know there are a lot of KitchenAid fans out there, but I am a Bosch girl all the way. Even after 35 years of service to my mother-in-law and to me, when my Bosch broke, I refused to buy any other machine until I could afford to replace it with a Bosch. So needless to say, I made bread for 3 years without a Bosch mixer, and I did it by hand. It doesn't change the amount of time it takes to make the recipe. It just means that when you do have the Bosch mixer, that your hands are free to do other things while the bread is going through the mixing and the kneading process. Now the big difference between the Bosch mixer and the other mixers is in the horsepower of the engine. Bosch is basically the Tim the Toolman Taylor Binford model of mixers, and it can do up to 4 loaves of bread in one recipe. Now the next thing you'll need is a good pan. I have found that a good size pan for a great size loaf of bread is an 8.5 by 4.5 loaf pan. It's perfect because it makes a loaf of bread that fits nicely into the toaster. The next thing I invested in was a cutting guide. I really had a hard time with everybody, especially my kids, trying to cut their own pieces of bread, and we would be eating wedges of bread, or their sandwiches would be like this thick. So we invested in a cutting guide to slide the loaf of bread in so that we could cut all of the slices the same. Get the water warm enough to where you can just begin to feel the heat on your wrist. Fill a measuring cup up with 6 cups of water and then pour that into your mixer. Add 1/2 cup of sugar and 3 heaping tablespoons of yeast into your mixer. Put the lid on, and then you're going to want to mix it. I'm going to turn the mixer on. You're going to want to mix it. And then you let the mixture sit for 3 to 5 minutes to allow the yeast to grow. And during the 3 to 5 minutes where the yeast is growing, I take that time to get the dry ingredients ready. So I put 6 cups of flour with 4 tablespoons of gluten flour in a bowl. Then I add 2 tablespoons of salt. Now I stir it in together. Now I put the salt in with the flour because I learned that when you add salt directly to the sugar yeast mixture, it starts to kill the yeast. It starts to slow the yeast down. But if you add it to your dry ingredients, it's not as a drastic change to the yeast. I also then pre-measure my 2/3 cup of oil, and I get those ready to add to the yeast mixture as soon as I've noticed it to start to grow. Now once the yeast has started to grow, then I go ahead and add in 2/3 cup of oil to the mixture. Then my first dry ingredients, which again is 6 cups of flour with 4 tablespoons of gluten flour, along with 2 tablespoons of salt. And I put this in the mixer. And then I turn it on just enough to mix it together and incorporate it, and then let it rest for 15 minutes.